Hello everyone, Mr. A here again, back for round 2 of our March Madness of picture books. Finally, we're on to round 2. Unfortunately, we have a tie for our last matchup, which was down here, The Babe and I and Baseball Saved Us. So if you have not watched that video yet, please watch that video. I'm going to wait till tomorrow morning to tally up the votes again, and hopefully we'll get some more votes. I know I have had people usually messaging me on Facebook or Instagram, or even some of my friends texting me their favorites or their children's favorites. So that will be very helpful to break the tie. If we are still at a tie in the morning, then I will have my son choose which one he likes best to be our tiebreaker, as I've mentioned in previous videos. For today, we're going to move on to round 2. Right at the top of our bracket on the opposite side, we have A Bad Case of Stripes versus Nothing Ever Happens on 90th Street. These two books won their matchup in the first round. So here they are, A Bad Case of Stripes by David Shannon and Nothing Ever Happens on 90th Street by Ronnie Schotter. Okay, so Nico's here to help us with our video today. Say hi, Nico.
Hi.
So if you hear any noise in the background, it's probably going to be him. He has his own books over here, his Dr. Seuss books. So he might be flipping through those or listening to the stories with us. So let's get started. Please don't forget to vote today. Share this with any of your friends who you think might enjoy. Now that we're on to the second round, we don't have much longer to go. So please share and make sure we are voting every day. You ready, Nico?
Yeah.
Also, don't forget, I have the links to both of these books. So I put an Amazon link, so if you want these books for your personal library or your children want them for read-alouds at home, the links are in the description below. Also, don't forget, these two are AR books, so make sure you are taking those AR tests, especially you students that are still in shelter in place. We do have access to AR. All of my students do. So my students, if you're watching, make sure you're taking your AR tests on these so you can get those points. First book of round 2, A Bad Case of Stripes. Camilla Cream loved lima beans, but she never ate them. All of her friends hated lima beans, and she wanted to fit in. Camilla was always worried about what other people thought of her. Today she was fretting even more than usual. It was the first day of school, and she couldn't decide what to wear. There were so many people to impress. She tried on 42 outfits, but none seemed quite right. She put on a pretty red dress and looked in the mirror. Then she screamed. Her mother ran in the room, and she screamed too. "Oh, my heavens!" she cried. "You're completely covered with stripes." This was certainly true. Camilla was striped from head to toe. She looked like a rainbow. Mrs. Cream felt Camilla's forehead. "Do you feel all right?" she asked. "I feel fine," Camilla answered. "But just look at me." "You get back in this bed this instant," her mother ordered. "You're not going to school today." Camilla was relieved. She didn't want to miss the first day of school, but she was afraid what the other kids would say. And she had no idea what to wear with those crazy stripes. That afternoon, Dr. Bumble came to examine Camilla. "Most extraordinary," he exclaimed. "I've never seen anything like it. Are you having any coughing, sneezing, runny nose, aches, pains, chills, hot flashes, dizziness, drowsiness, shortness of breath, or uncontrollable twitching?" "No," Camilla told him. "I feel fine." "Well then," Dr. Bumble said, turning to Mrs. Cream, "I don't see any reason why she shouldn't go to school tomorrow. Here's some ointment that should help clear up those stripes in a few days. If it doesn't, you know where to reach me." And off he went. The next day was a disaster. Everyone at school laughed at Camilla. They called her Camilla Crown and Night of the Living Lollipop. She tried her best to act as if everything were normal. But when the class said the Pledge of Allegiance, her stripes turned red, white, and blue, and she broke out into stars. The other kids thought this was great. One yelled out, "Let's see some purple polka dots." Sure enough, Camilla turned all purple polka dotty. Someone else shouted, "Checkerboard!" and a pattern of squares covered her skin. Soon, everyone was calling out different shapes and colors, and poor Camilla was changing faster than you can change channels on the TV.
On the TV.
That night, Mr. Harms, the school principal, called. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Cream," he said. "I'm going to have to ask you to keep Camilla home from school. She's just too much of a distraction. And I've been getting calls from other parents. They're afraid those stripes may be contagious. Camilla was so embarrassed. She couldn't believe that 2 days ago everyone liked her. Now nobody wanted to be in the same room with her. Her father tried to make her feel better. "Is there anything I can get you, sweetheart?" he asked. "No, thank you," sighed Camilla. What she really wanted was a nice plate of lima beans, but she had been laughed at long enough for one day.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I see, Dr. Bumble mumbled when Mrs. Cream phoned the next day. "I think I'd better bring in the specialist. We'll be right over." About half an hour later, Dr. Bumble arrived with 4 people in long white coats. He introduced them to the Creams. "This is Dr. Grop, Dr. Sponge, Dr. Cricket, and Dr. Young." Then the specialist went to work on Camilla. They squeezed and jabbed, tapped and tested. It was very uncomfortable. "Well, it's not the mumps," concluded Dr. Grop. "Or the measles," said Dr. Sponge. "Definitely not the chicken pox," put in Dr. Cricket. "Or sunburn," said Dr. Young. "Try these," said the specialist. They each handed her a bottle filled with different colored pills. "Take one each before you go to bed," said Dr. Grop. Then they filed out the door, followed by Dr. Bumble.
What are those things?
That night, Camilla took her medicine. It was awful.
What are those things?
When she woke up the next morning, she did feel different, but when she got dressed, her clothes didn't fit right. She looked in the mirror, and there, staring back at her, was a giant, multicolored pill with her face on it. Dr. Bumble rushed over as soon as Mrs. Cream called, but this time, instead of the specialist, he brought the experts. Dr. Gord and Dr. Mellon were the finest scientific minds in the land. Once again, Camilla was poked and prodded, looked over and listened to. The experts wrote down lots of numbers. Then they huddled together and whispered. Dr. Gord finally spoke. "It might be a virus," he announced with authority. Suddenly, fuzzy little virus balls appeared all over Camilla. "Or possibly some form of bacteria," said Mr. Mellon. Out popped squiggly little bacteria tails. "Or it could be fungus," added Dr. Gord. Instantly, Camilla was covered with different colored fungus blotches. The experts looked at Camilla, then at each other. "We need to go over these numbers again back at the lab," Dr. Gord explained. "We'll call you when we know something." But the experts didn't have a clue, much less a cure. By now, the TV news had found out about Camilla. Reporters from every channel were outside of her house, telling the story of the bizarre case of the incredible changing kid. Soon, a huge crowd was camped out on the front lawn. The Creams were swamped with all kinds of remedies from psychologists, allergists, herbalists, nutritionists, psychics, an old medicine man, a guru, and even a veterinarian. Each so-called cure only added to poor Camilla's strange appearance, until it was hard to even recognize her. She sprouted roots and berries and crystals and feathers and a long furry tail, but nothing worked. One day, a woman who called herself an environmental therapist claimed she could cure Camilla. "Close your eyes," she said. "Breathe deeply and become one with your room." "I wish you hadn't said that," Camilla groaned. Slowly, she started to melt into the walls of her room. Her bed became her mouth, her nose was her dresser, and 2 paintings were her eyes. The therapist screamed and ran from the house. "What are we going to do?" cried Mrs. Cream. "It just keeps getting worse and worse." She began to sob.
That's how you...
At that moment, Mr. Cream heard a quiet knock at the front door. He opened it, and there stood an old woman who was just as plump and sweet as a strawberry. "Excuse me," she said brightly, "but I think I can help." She went into Camilla's room and looked around. "My goodness," she said with a shake of her head. "What we have here is a bad case of stripes. One of the worst I've ever seen. She pulled a container of small green beans from her bag. Here, she said. These might do the trick. Are those magic beans? Asked Mrs. Cream. Oh my, no, replied the old woman. There's no such thing. These are just plain old lima beans. I'll bet you'd like some, wouldn't you? She asked Camilla. Camilla wanted a big heaping plate full of lima beans more than just about anything, but she was still too afraid to admit it. Yuck, she said. No one likes lima beans, especially me. Oh dear, the old woman said sadly. I guess I was wrong about you. She put the beans back in her bag and started toward the door. Camilla watched the old woman walk away. Those beans would taste so good, and being laughed at for eating them was nothing compared to what she'd been going through. She finally couldn't stand it. Watch out, silly. Wait, she cried. The truth is, I really love lima beans. I thought so, the old woman said with a smile. She took a handful of beans and popped them into Camilla's mouth. Mmm, said Camilla. Suddenly, the branches, feathers, and squiggly tails began to disappear. Then the whole room swirled around, and when it stopped, there stood Camilla, and everything was back to normal. I'm cured, she shouted. Yes, said the old woman. I knew the real you was in there. Somewhere. She patted Camilla on the head. Then she went outside and vanished into the crowd. Afterward, Camilla wasn't quite the same. Some of the kids at school said she was weird, but she didn't care a bit. She ate all the lima beans she wanted, and she never had a touch of stripes again. The end. Okay, book number 2 of our second round matchup, Nothing Ever Happens on 90th Street by Ronnie Schotter. Remember, again, the links are below in the description. Don't forget, these are AR books. Eva unwrapped a cinnamon Danish, opened her notebook, and stared helplessly at the wide white pages. Write about what you know, her teacher, Mrs. DeMarco, had told her. So Eva sat high on the stoop and looked out over 90th Street, waiting for something to happen. A horn honked, a radio rapped, a kid cried, the usual. Nothing ever happens on 90th Street, Eva scribbled in her notebook. A few doors down, Mr. Chang was arranging fish fillets in his newly opened seafood emporium. No one was buying, and his shop looked as empty and ignored as the tiny boarded-up store next door to it. He nodded to a woman passing by and called hello to Eva. Out the door of Eva's building came Mr. Sims, the actor, carrying his enormous cat, Oliver. Mr. Sims was on hiatus again, which means out of work, in between shows. And so every day, dressed in his finest, he embarked on a daily promenade with Oliver under his arm. Writing? He asked. Trying to, Eva answered. But nothing ever happens on 90th Street. You are mistaken, my dear, Mr. Sims said. The whole world's a stage, even 90th Street, and each of us plays a part. Watch the stage, observe the players carefully, and don't neglect the details, he said, stroking Oliver. Follow an old actor's advice, and you will find you have plenty to write about. Thanks, Eva said, and as fast as she could, using as many details as she could recall, Eva described Mr. Sims in her notebook. His felt fedora hat, his curly gray hair, his shiny button shoes. When she looked up, he was halfway down the street, and Mr. Morley, the moose maker, was at his window. Just as he did every day, Mr. Morley set his chocolate pot and coffee urn out on his ledge with a sign. Mr. Morley dreamed of having a catering business where the fanciest people demanded his desserts. But the trouble was, Mr. Morley's moose was missing something. No matter how he tried, his moose never had much taste, and Mr. Morley never had many customers. Writing? He asked. Mm-hmm. Eva answered, chewing on her pencil. Tried to find the poetry in your pudding, Mr. Morley said softly. There's always a new way with words. You're right, Eva said, wishing Mr. Morley would one day find the poetry in his pudding. Taking his advice, she tried to think up a new way to describe the look of Mr. Morley's moose. Smooth and dark as midnight, or maybe more like mink. Yes, that was it, Eva thought, writing in her notebook.
I'm finished with my book.
The door to the building slammed and a gust of wind sent dead leaves soaring and dipping like crazy kites. Alexis Leora nodded to Eva and stepped gracefully down the steps to do her warm-up exercises. Alexis was a dancer. When she wanted to, she could hold an extremely long leg straight up against her ear like a one-legged woman with 3 arms. But she couldn't smile. Eva decided it was because Alexis Leora was lonely. Writing? Alexis Leora asked Eva. Yes, Eva answered. Alexis Leora did 6 deep knee bends and then sighed. Stretch, she said softly. Use your imagination. If your story doesn't go the way you want it to, you can always stretch the truth. You can ask, what if? And make up a better story. You're right, Eva said, thinking, what if? What if Alexis Leora met someone? Would she smile then? What would that look like? Eva closed her eyes and tried to picture it. But all she could picture was soup. Spanish soup. Rich and brown and so spicy, it seemed as if she could actually smell it. She could! When Eva opened her eyes, Mrs. Martinez was standing beside her. She nodded to Alexis Leora and she handed Eva a bowl of soup. Have some, she said. Writers need soup. What's your story about? Nothing much, Eva sighed. Nothing ever happens on 90th Street. Add a little action, Mrs. Martinez said. Like soup, a little of this, a little of that. And don't forget the spice. Mix it, stir it, make something happen. Surprise yourself. She nodded again to Alexis Leora and went inside. Eva put down her pencil and tasted Mrs. Martinez's wonderful, surprising soup. She thought about her story. It was wonderful. It wasn't surprising. But what could she do? Nothing ever happened on 90th Street. How could she possibly add a little action and make something happen? Eva had no idea. She was stuck. Then Mrs. Friedman from up the block came wheeling baby Joshua in his stroller. He was holding a bright red ball in 2 tiny fat hands. Bird, he called out to a pigeon hunting for something to eat. Bird hungry. Pigeon, Mrs. Friedman told him. Eva sighed and looked down at her half-eaten Danish, then at her notebook. She looked at baby Joshua, then at the pigeon. She remembered Alexis Leora's words of advice. What if? Eva thought. Suddenly, she had an idea. What if she stood up, broke her Danish into dozens of tiny pieces, and scattered them wide and wild into the street? What would happen? Eva laughed to think of it. From lampposts to ledges, dozens of pigeons swooped down to dine on the Danish. Eva eagerly picked up her pencil and began to write again. Bird, baby Joshua called out, pointing. More bird, he cried, panting. The bright red ball dropped out of his tiny fat hands and bounced onto the sidewalk. Bye-bye, ball, baby Joshua screamed. The ball rolled off the curb and into the street and straight into the path of the pizza delivery man on his bicycle. Everyone gasped in horror. Alexis Leora paused in mid-ply and leaped to the rescue. She got there just as the pizza delivery man landed, right side up at her feet. Alexis Leora looked down at the pizza man, and he looked up at her. And then something almost unimaginable happened. Alexis Leora smiled. Are you all right? She asked shyly. Her smile was sweet and bright. Her teeth were straight and white. It was the first time Eva or anyone on 90th Street had seen them. "Yes," said the pizza man, smiling up at her. It was love at first sight. Pepperoni and peppers rained down on the happy couple. The pizza man pulled a pepper out of his hair as horns began to honk. Eva added this to her notebook and wondered what could possibly happen next. A long white limousine was honking its horn loudest of all. The limo driver rolled down his window. "What do you want to block traffic for?" he called out. The back door of the limo opened, and out stepped a woman in sunglasses, wearing a turban and a coat the color of a taxi. "There seems to be a problem, Harry," she said in a fake English accent. "There's some sort of accident here, perhaps." "It's Sandra!" somebody suddenly screamed, interrupting her. "Sandra, can I have your autograph?" Mrs. Martinez called out. "Sandra Saunderson?" Mr. Morley blushed. Was Eva dreaming? There, in the middle of 90th Street, larger than life, stood Sandra Saunderson, star of stage, screen, and the sensational soap opera One World to Live. "Darlings, what happened here? I'm sure Larry?" she called out suddenly, and stretched her arms toward Mr. Sim, who had just returned from his promenade. "It's been an age since we saw each other." Mr. Sim's cat, about to be crushed in an extravagant embrace, leaped out of Mr. Sim's arm and chased after baby Joshua's ball. "Oliver!" Mr. Sim called out. "Come back!" Everyone raced into the street after the ball, but it was the limo driver who, in the right place at the right time, leaned into the gutter and picked up the ball. With a flick of the wrist, he tossed the ball to Mrs. Friedman, who presented it to a drooling but grateful baby Joshua. "How's that for a throw?" the limo driver said proudly, as he proudly asked the crowd. No one, not even baby Joshua, had a chance to answer. Oliver, frightened by so many people, raced past Eva, scrambled onto Mr. Morley's ledge, where he knocked over his coffee urn, spilling all the coffee into his mousse pot. "Ruined!" Mr. Morley cried, wringing his hands. At that, Oliver bounded to the top of the ginkgo tree, where he swayed dangerously like a heavy white balloon. "Now he'll never come down," Mr. Sims lamented. "He's terribly stubborn." There, Larry," Sandra Saunderson comforted him. "I'm sure someone on 90th Street will have a solution." Eva tried to imagine who that could possibly be. "I have one," she heard Mr. Chang call out. Generously, he offered trout, fresh from his store, to Oliver. High up in the tree, Oliver barely blinked. "Raw trout?" Mr. Sims sighed. "My regrets, Mr. Chang. He won't eat it. He's a gourmet cat. I'm afraid I've spoiled him. Whatever will I do?" What if? Eva asked herself for the second time that day, and suddenly she had another idea, a truly great one. She whispered it to Mr. Morley, Mrs. Martinez, and Mr. Chang. "Brilliant!" Mr. Morley exclaimed. And with that, he, Mrs. Martinez, and Mr. Chang, still clutching his trout, vanished into the building. Eva righted Mr. Morley's coffee urn and stuck her finger into his ruined mousse, then into her mouth to determine the degree of the damage. "Mocha!" she called out in surprise. "Mr. Morley's mousse is mocha now, and—" She paused, trying to find the perfect word. "Magnificent!" she announced to the assembled throng, and giving the pot a stir, she dished out samples to all assembled. "Delicious!" Alexis Leora said, spooning some into the pizza man's mouth. "Poetry!" Sandra Saunderson pronounced. Now, on 90th Street, people who had never spoken to one another before were speaking at last. The pizza delivery man and the limo driver shook hands, and everyone tried to tempt Oliver down from his precarious perch. And then, Mr. Morley appeared on the steps, followed by Mrs. Martinez and Mr. Chang. Mrs. Martinez carried a large pot of her surprising soup, while Mr. Morley carried a platter of Mr. Chang's trout, now surrounded by many tiny vegetables and cooked to perfection. With the addition of a cup of Mr. Morley's cat-created mocha mousse, it was a meal worthy of the finest culinary establishments. "Do you smell that, Oliver?" Mr. Sims called, fanning the steam so it rose up to the ginkgo tree. Oliver took one deep sniff and bolted down the tree to dine. Everyone on 90th Street sampled each course, and everyone on 90th Street sighed with delight. "Superb! Fantastico! Yum!" Eva smiled and glanced up from her notebook. For the third time that day, she asked herself, what if? "Mr. Chang," she began, "you and Mr. Morley and Mrs. Martinez are such great cooks. The boarded-up store next to your seafood emporium, what if all of you used it for a restaurant?" "A restaurant?" The three chefs looked at one another. "What a wonderful idea!" they said, shaking Eva's hand. "Everyone on 90th Street could be our customers. You too, Sandra." "Everyone but me," Mr. Sims said regretfully. "Just now I'm between jobs and a bit low on cash." "No longer," Sandra called out. "You'll be on my show. I'll arrange it." Mr. Sims kissed Sandra's hand and everyone cheered. "What an amazing day," Mrs. Martinez said. "Who would believe it? If only someone had written it all down." "I did," Eva announced, and she opened her notebook and began to read her story, the same story you're reading now, about how nothing ever happened on 90th Street. "What a story!" Sandra exclaimed. "Full of detail, dialogue, suspense, a bit of poetry, a hint of romance, even a happy ending. Why, you'd almost think some of it was made up." Eva smiled mysteriously. "Thanks," she said proudly. "But just wait. It'll be even better after I rewrite it." And that's the end. Okay, that's all for today, so make sure you please go and vote. And again, we will announce our winner in tomorrow's video. We'll announce our winner of The Babe and I and Baseball Saved Us to see who moves on to the second round on that side of the bracket. Okay, goodbye, everyone. Nico, you want to say goodbye?
Yeah.
Say bye, everyone.
Bye.